What would it take for you to sacrifice yourself for a loved one? Is there anyone you would give your life for now? What is the true definition of sacrifice? Well, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, sacrifice means destruction or surrender of something for the sake of something else. This is demonstrated in both One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey and 1984 by George Orwell. It is interesting to compare these two novels because although they have similarities, they approach sacrifice in a different way. The two characters' sacrifices are different, the authors make the readers view sacrifice in a different way, and the characters react to sacrifice in a different way. Let's begin. In the books, the characters are sacrificed in very different ways, but for the same reason. Orwell, in 1984, uses sacrifice to demonstrate the power and intelligence of authorities. The party physically tortured Winston, but also found a way to mentally torture him. Winston knew that if he asked them to stop the torture, they would torture Julia, his loved one, instead. Orwell writes on page 344, "You have whimpered for mercy. You have betrayed everybody and everything. Can you think of a single degradation that has not happened to you?" Winston had stopped weeping, though the tears were still oozing out of his eyes. He looked up at O'Brien. "I have not betrayed Julia," he said. This shows the reader the intense love they share and the manipulation used by the party. In Cuckoo's Nest, McMurphy's lobotomy shows that the authority, Nurse Ratched, was willing to make McMurphy a martyr because she could not put up with him anymore. She says on page 136, "I believe if he was sent to disturb now, it would be exactly what the patients would expect. He would be a martyr to them. They would never be given the opportunity to see that this man is not, as you put it, Mr. Gideon, an extraordinary person." This quote is Nurse Ratched explaining why she cannot send McMurphy to Disturbed, but by the end of the book, she gets too fed up. This contrasts 1984 because instead of finding a way to manipulate McMurphy, the nurse gives up and takes the easy way out. While this was not a willing sacrifice by McMurphy, it represents to the other patients that McMurphy had won over the nurse, and therefore gave them a feeling of power. Chief Bromden explains that she saw McMurphy was growing bigger than ever while he was upstairs where the guys couldn't see the dent she was making on him, growing into almost a legend, page 244. In 1984, Winston is physically tortured for weeks. It is very intense, and the authorities do not stop until they break him. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, McMurphy's sacrifice is getting a lobotomy. This, like Winston, makes him not able to think well enough to function as a human being. Next, Winston is deeply in love with Julia, so he sacrifices himself so that she does not have to be tortured. This is different than One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest because McMurphy did not choose to get a lobotomy. However, it was still a sacrifice because he became a martyr to the men in the ward who he had gotten close to. He also knew that while he was wreaking havoc, there would be consequences that he was willing to face. This shows that Winston was willing to sacrifice himself for love, while McMurphy did not have control over his sacrifice. Winston even talks to Julia about what would happen if they got caught and how they would never betray each other. They say, "Neither of us will even know whether the other is alive or dead. We shall be utterly without power of any kind. The one thing that matters is that we shouldn't betray one another, although even that can't make the slightest difference." "If you mean confessing," she said, "we shall do that right enough. Everybody always confesses. You can't help it. They torture you." "I don't mean confessing. Confession is not betrayal. What you say or do doesn't matter. Only feelings matter. If they could make me stop loving you, that would be the real betrayal." Page 209. Moving on. In the two novels, the authors make readers view sacrifice in very different ways. In 1984, Winston is tortured intensely until he truly loves Big Brother and asks them to torture Julia instead of him. Orwell spends a large amount of time describing Winston's torture and makes sure that the reader understands how intense the torture is. On page 359, Orwell writes, "By itself," he said, "pain is not always enough. There are occasions where a human being will stand out against pain, even to the point of death. But for everyone, there is something unendurable, something that cannot be contemplated. Courage and cowardice are not involved. If you are falling from a height, it is not cowardly to clutch at a rope. If you have come up deep from water, it is not cowardly to fill your lungs with air. It is merely an instinct which cannot be destroyed. It is the same with the rats. For you, they are unendurable. They are a form of pressure that you cannot withstand even if you wished to." This quote shows how evil the torture was in 1984. However, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Orwell does not focus on the lobotomy. Instead, he shows the reader the results on McMurphy's friends, not on the intense and tragic sacrifice. More so, Orwell focuses on the character who is sacrificed afterwards, while Kesey focuses on the effects on the character's close friends. The main point of the sacrifice in 1984 was to change Winston to obey what the party wanted. They wanted to break him so that they could put thoughts into his head. After he breaks, Orwell writes about his thoughts after. He lets the reader see into Winston's brain so that we can see how messed up he is. He writes, "He was overwhelmed by a desire not so much to get away from Julia as to get back to the Chestnut Tree Cafe, which had never seemed so attractive as at this moment." Page 370. This quote shows the effect that the torture had on Winston's brain. It describes the interaction him and Julia have after they have both been tortured. They are repulsed by each other. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, we do not get any insight into how McMurphy thinks after his lobotomy. Instead, the reader gets to see how his sacrifice affects the other characters in the books. The narrator, Chief Bromden, says on page 322, "I was only sure of one thing. He wouldn't have left something like that sit there in the day room with his name tacked on it for 20 or 30 years, so the big nurse could use it as an example of what can happen if you buck the system. I was sure of that." After the lobotomy, the narrator, Chief Bromden, shares his view of McMurphy after, and how he would not take anything from the big nurse. This leads to Chief Bromden killing McMurphy to keep his legacy alive. Lastly, the two characters have different views of sacrifice. Winston sacrifices himself for romantic love, while McMurphy sacrifices himself for brotherly love. Winston is in love with Julia and will do anything to keep her safe, even torture. He knew in the back of his brain that he loved Julia and would never betray her. It reads on page 289, "He felt the smash of truncheons on his elbows and iron-shod boots on his shins. He saw himself groveling on the floor, screaming for mercy through broken teeth. He hardly thought of Julia. He could fix his mind on her. He loved her and would not betray her." McMurphy, at first, sacrifices himself by messing with the big nurse for the amusement of the other mental patients, as well as to make them feel powerful. He takes them on a fishing trip and helps the boys feel invincible for once. One of the men say, "Never before did I realize that mental illness could have the aspect of power. Think of it. Perhaps the more insane a man is, the more powerful he could become. Hitler, an example. There makes the old brain reel, doesn't it?" Page 238. This shows that the boys really looked up to McMurphy, which made it even more of a sign when McMurphy was lobotomized. When he gets lobotomized, he still makes the men feel confident because he beat the big nurse, which makes the men view her as weak. Furthermore, Winston was willing to sacrifice himself to the point of nearly death, while McMurphy could not stop what was happening to him. Winston saw the torture as a way to save Julia, his loved one. He saw it as a way to be heroic and brave, so he was willing until a certain point to save her. McMurphy, however, was not willing to get a lobotomy. He did not know it was happening and did not expect for the nurse to give up. Although he risked getting in trouble, he did not think it would go that far. Finally, the characters after the sacrifices are different, but the goal was the same. Clearly, Winston and McMurphy were sacrificed in different ways, so they had different results. However, they both ended up mentally impaired. Although McMurphy's brain was physically torn, Winston could also not think for himself. McMurphy had beat the authorities while Winston had lost. The last page of 1984 is heartbreaking, but shows the true loss Winston suffered. 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. Page 376. To conclude, in both One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and 1984, the 2 main characters are sacrificed for the good of other characters in the book. The sacrifices are very different, but they both have the same motivation and result. However, the differences are what make the situations interesting to compare and contrast. Thank you.